Hello, everyone, and welcome to another wonderful day of chemistry. So today we're going to be talking about how we can take our redox reactions and set them up in electrochemical cells so we can actually monitor and potentially harvest the electrons produced. So one of the big things to remember is if I've got a redox reaction, if I try and use the net redox reaction, there's not a lot I can do with the system because I don't have any way to try and interact with the electrons. So the first step of building an electrochemical cell is to first divide it into the oxidation reaction, which we tend to put on the left, and the reduction reaction, which we put on the right. Remember, reduction goes on the right. Now, because of the fun nature of electrochemical cells, it's often very common to also refer to these by the names of the electrodes that are used to drive these reactions. So the electrode on the left is called the anode. So oxidation anode, vowel with vowel. And on the right, it's called a cathode. So cathode reduction, consonant with consonant. So cathode reduces on the right, and in this case, that's our copper reaction. And the anode oxidizes on the left, which goes on, in this case, is our zinc reaction. So then to actually drive this reaction, I have to have all the relevant species and all the relevant cells. So here on the left, I'm going to have my zinc solid, which will function as my electrode. So any electrons that are kicked off come from this zinc electrode and go straight onto a wire, and then produces my zinc 2+ ions. On the other hand, any electrons that come in are going to come in through this wire onto this copper surface and then grab a copper. So again, one of the things that's worth noting is that all of the reactions in both of these cells are going to occur essentially within a couple of nanometers from the surface. So if I have a big beaker full of zinc 2+ ions, the only part that's actually going to react are near this electrode surface, so near my anode and near my cathode. However, in order for this reaction to actually occur, the electrons need to be able to go from the anode to the cathode. So they're going to have to travel along this wire. And as I've said, we probably want to do something to measure the movement of these electrons. That's typically done by putting a voltameter in here if you're interested in the energy of these electrons or to collect the potential, or you could put an amp meter here to measure the current or the rate at which the electrons move from left to right. So then the problem becomes that I need to go ahead and keep the charges balanced, because as the reaction proceeds, I've got more and more negative charge moving on to my cathode, which means that quickly I have a separation of charges, which, as we've seen throughout the course, is a bad thing. So to counteract this buildup of negative charges over here on the cathode, I'm going to put in a salt bridge. So this salt bridge is going to be some sort of salt that isn't playing a role in the reaction. So I need some sort of salt that doesn't form a precipitate or a solid with either the ions in my cathode or the anode. So very common things are things like potassium nitrate. So potassium doesn't pretty much form a precipitate with anybody, and same thing with nitrate. However, watch out, because when you get to extreme conditions, nitrate itself can undergo some redox reactions. So what we start to see here is that to counteract the negative charge of the electrons moving on to your cathode, you have to also have a functioning salt bridge that can move some positively charged ions also onto the cathodic cell. This way, the charge stays constant. And it is worth noting that if you ever let your salt bridge dry out, the reaction stops dead because we can't keep the ions, the charges balanced, and thus the electrons don't want to go because it's way too negative there. I don't like it and I don't want it. And this is what we're going to tend to see, especially when we get into lab and do some electrochemical reactions. So one of the things that we can do is that it's a little bit much to try and draw out our nice electrochemical cell every time, nor do we want to go ahead and write all of our redox reactions every time. And especially because there's a lot of extra information that I'm going to want to put into my cell that wouldn't be incorporated in just normal reaction, because it's going to be very important that we know the concentration of all of our ions, whether it's our zinc or our copper. And again, it's just kind of inconvenient to draw a picture every time. So we're going to generate what's called a line notation. And so line notation is just a shorthand that represents each part of the cell. So what we're going to do is have a short abbreviation that shows each part of the cell with a vertical line that represents every time we have a phase change. So for example, here, I'm going to start on the left with my anode, and then I'm going to work my way not through the path of the electrons, but more or less through the path of my ions, going through the salt bridge over into the other cell and ending on the cathode. So I'm going to start with a solid and I'm going to end with a solid. So in this case, I'm going to start with my zinc, and then I go into my aqueous solution, which contains zinc 2+ ions. And again, it's very useful to go ahead and represent the concentration here, though not always required. Then we have a very special case here where we do a double line to represent first we enter a salt bridge and then we leave the salt bridge. So this double line will tell you when you leave the anodic half cell and enter the cathodic half cell. So then once we get to the other end of this double line, then we're back into solution with our nice copper ions, and then we end on the final electrode, in this case, the cathode. So start with anode, work towards cathode. Every phase change is represented by a line. Need to represent all electrochemically active species. So in this case, zinc 2+ and copper 2+. Some conventions will also include all of the counterions, just so you know what counterions are present in solution and their approximate concentrations. But at very least, we need the identity of each species along. More information is always useful. However, one of the things that's worth noting is that not all reactions are so simple as the one we've shown here, where we have a metal or even a solid present in both of our half reactions, zinc for the anode and copper for the cathode. A lot of reactions don't include any solid. So a good example is I can try and use hydrogen to reduce copper. And this is one way you can generate copper solid, is have a oxidizing source. In this case, hydrogen is a very good reducing source as it oxidizes fairly well. So in this case, I have a problem because while I can use copper as my cathode on the right, I don't really have anything to use for an anode. So in this case, we often use platinum. And one of the reasons why we like platinum is that it facilitates an easy transfer of electrons. It easily grabs electrons and moves them through solution, and it doesn't really do any redox reactions of its own. So you'll often find platinum used in a lot of electrochemical processes on a daily basis. And it's one of the reasons why somebody may be trying to steal your catalytic converters, because it uses a platinum catalyst, which can go for quite a lot on the open market. So in this case, we can have a very similar cathode to what we did last time. I'm going to have copper ions in solution and copper solid for my cathode. However, for the anode, we're going to use this platinum solid, and our solution will contain our protons. But becomes the issue. Last time, we didn't have a reactant that was a gas. So anytime you have a gas, you're often going to include them in solution by bubbling them in. So you're going to have some sort of high pressure hydrogen, which will then bubble into solution. And in practice, in order to prevent the hydrogen from going everywhere, and remembering that the reaction only occurs near the electrode, you'll often put some sort of tube over the electrode to make sure that all hydrogen gas stays fairly close to the electrode where it will have maximum reactivity. So one of the big notes here is that we also now have to include hydrogen in our line notation. So how do we do that? So again, we're going to start with our anode, which this time is going to be platinum. And then I'm going to have to do a line between any of these solid and any other species. So this time, instead of going straight from solid to aqueous, I'm going to have to include that gas somewhere in between, because again, I will have to go from aqueous to salt bridge because the gas ain't over there. So we can start with our anode, then work to the gas, then to the aqueous, then to the salt bridge, then to our next aqueous set of solutions, and finally to our cathode. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how you can construct and interpret electrochemical cells. Next time, we're going to go ahead and focus a little bit more on what information we can get from measuring the potential of a reaction. Until then, take care.